Our God, we pray that you would flow in these words that are spoken so that we may perceive your presence and substance. Be in our hearts so that each one of us is able to take your heart home with us. We pray that you would guide our speaking, guide our listening, and guide our living responses. Amen. Stephen and I prepared the bulletins for this morning a few weeks ago. Our co-worker has been out of the country, and so when we picked the hymn, Bless the God of Israel, a few weeks ago, we didn't think anything about it. And then this week, when we read the printed bulletins, we thought, wow, that sounds a little differently now. Yes, of course, we absolutely say, bless the God of Israel, and we say, bless the God of Palestine, and bless the God of all peoples whose backs are against the wall. As the hymn continued on that we just sang, it spoke about how we all long for this liberty and liberation that God calls us to, which was this original blessing. As a human people, we are so caught up in knowing who is in and who is out and who gets to decide. In October of 1636, Roger Williams was banished and fled Massachusetts for espousing new and radical opinions, and received refuge from the Wampanoag people. For some time, we in our Sunday mornings have been following the life of Moses and the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. In the adult forum preceding this hour, many of our members have been looking at human migration and people who are forced to become refugees, and who is in and who is out, and who gets to determine this. Following the scourge of the plagues on Egypt, the Israelites, depending on one's perspective, were either expelled from Egypt or released from their bondage. And they booked it out of there as quickly as they could before the Pharaoh could change his mind one more time. It says, as we heard from Exodus chapter 12, during the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go and worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs, wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites finally leave, with unleavened bread and fine possessions of the Egyptians, whose hearts had already softened toward them. They flee not as slaves, but dressed out people raised to a new life in a new land. The passage goes on to say that the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Y'all do the math. Many other people went with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. According to United Nations report, in the last 2 weeks, 4,200 people have been killed. Over 1 million displaced in just 10 days, and large areas in the Gaza Strip have been reduced to rubble. The toll falls disproportionately on civilians and innocents. Many thousands have been injured, and more continue to seek refuge. Many remain missing. We grieve the horror of the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. We grieve the impossible situation of the Palestinian people forced to live under occupation in their own lands. The death toll includes large numbers of innocents, children, journalists, medical staff, UN workers. Friends, we can hold multiple truths at once. We know that the Palestinians are not Hamas, that the Jewish people are not the Israeli government, and we know that this conflict didn't begin a few weeks ago. It's been going on and on and on for generations. We can hold these multiple griefs simultaneously. Scripture is replete with displaced people, people fleeing one place, trying to find refuge somewhere else. It says the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. 600,000 men besides women and children, and many other people went with them. It says they baked loaves of unleavened bread. Why unleavened bread? Didn't they prepare in advance for their redemption? Didn't God promise over and over again that liberation was at hand? Everyone saw the devastating effects of the 10 plagues. If that wasn't a get your bag packed prep, I don't know what was. But even with all of this, and maybe because of all of this, they still have time only to prepare matzah, a bread that hasn't even had time to rise, because they leave Egypt in such a hurry. It says they had not prepared provisions for themselves. Ellen Frankel observes that to a slave, planning for the future is a luxury that she or he cannot afford. And a Pharaoh's promises can never be trusted. Even the few hours that it takes bread to leaven and rise may turn out to be only a temporary reprieve from suffering rather than a prelude to real freedom. The Israelite women believe that they're only truly free when they're finally able to sit down together in their tents with babies on their knees, waiting for their dough to rise. Because what does it take, friends, for dough to rise? Time. And what does that dough need to do before it rises? It needs to rest. Friends, we have to be able to rest before we can rise, and this was not a luxury they possessed in that moment. How much more for people do we need rest in order to rise? But for now, all they have is flatbread. And it says that the Israelites were not the only ones who hoofed it out of there when Moses gave the word. This mixed crowd, along with the Israelites, this mixed multitude, suggests a kind of interesting ambiguity in the text that I want y'all to pay attention to, because there's always going to be these two strands at play here. You've got the very formally identified people, the Hebrew people who are going out, when we have a fixed idea of who that is, but then we also have this other storyline at the same time of this mixed multitude, which suggests this awareness that a company of escaping slaves does not enjoy the luxury of fixed identity or genealogy. And when somebody gives the word saying, y'all, let's go get free, a whole bunch of people are going to hit the road. This was a multitude without pedigree or genealogy. All manner of humankind and creature kind left Egypt that night. If we go back a few chapters in the Exodus narrative, when Moses and the Pharaoh were still arguing back and forth about whether or not the people will be released, Moses had said to Pharaoh, let us go, and Pharaoh had said at one point, sure, but leave all your livestock behind. And Moses said at that point, our livestock must also go with us. Not a hoof will be left behind. Not a hoof denotes that God's liberating work is for everybody. It says every male and female of the community, every part of every animal. Moses' response represents God's will for the freedom of the entire community. And this sense of belonging extends to every member of that community. And this liberation, friends, is so profound. Don't miss this, that it goes beyond just one people. It's not just the Israelites. It goes to this mixed multitude of humanity, and then further beyond that to include all creature kind. Because we recognize that when freedom is truly free, it's always going to be inclusive. The Exodus story isn't just some ancient story, but a living narrative that is relevant to our contemporary lives and concerns. We are still a people on the move, trying to decide who's in and who's out, and who gets to call those shots. Toni Morrison wrote a piece called The Foreigner's Home, where she reflects on the notion of traversing borders in the light of our own feelings of where we belong and where we don't belong, whatever our national origin or citizenship. She says, excluding the height of the slave trade in the 19th century, the mass movement of peoples in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st is greater now than it's ever been. It's a movement of workers and intellectuals, refugees, armies crossing oceans, continents, immigrants through custom offices and hidden routes, speaking multiple languages of trade, of political intervention, of persecution, exile, violence, and poverty. Noting that the violent handling of populations at and across borders is not new, Toni Morrison considers what history so clearly teaches us about the consequences if we have only the conscience and courage not to turn a blind eye to this kind of movement. She says forced or eager exodus into strange territory, whether it's psychological or geographical, is indelible in the history of every quadrant of the known world, from the trek of Africans into China and Australia, to military interventions by Romans and Ottomans and Europeans, to merchant forays fulfilling the desires of a plethora of regimes and monarchies and republics. From Venice to Virginia, from Liverpool to Hong Kong, all these and more have transferred the riches and art they found into other realms, and all these left that foreign soil stained with their blood or transplanted into the veins of the conquered, while in their wake the languages of conquered and conqueror swell with condemnation of each other. We've had these exchanges of peoples and place since time immemorial. And we continue to move in these ways and to understand ourselves differently as a result of these movements. Morrison suggests how this global fragmentation of identity affects our own private experiences of belonging. She says now we have these different senses of ourselves. We introduce ourselves in these plethora of hyphenated designations of national identity. Now our place of origin has become more telling than our citizenship, and people are identified as a German citizen of such and such origin, or a British citizen of such and such origin, all while we have this kind of new, multi-layered cultural citizenship. She suggests that the relocation of peoples has ignited and disrupted the idea of home and expanded our focus of identity beyond just our actual citizenship to how we clarify ourselves within this definition. She suggests that the spectacle of mass movement draws attention inevitably to borders, these porous places, the vulnerable points where one's concept of home is seen as being menaced by foreigners. Much of the alarm hovering at our borders, the gates, is stoked, it seems, she says, by one, the threat and the promise of globalism, and two, an uneasy relationship with our own foreignness, our own rapidly disintegrating sense of belonging. This morning we see a group of people who are seeking a sense of belonging, trying to find a place that they can call home, where they have sufficient space to rest and rise. But it seems, Morrison goes on to say, that it may be the most defining characteristic of our times is that, again, walls and weapons feature as prominently now as they once did in medieval times. Porous borders are understood in some quarters to be areas of threat and certain chaos, whether real or imagined. Enforced separation is posited as the solution. And walls, ammunition, they do work for a while, but they are major failures over time as the occupants of casual, unmarked, and mass grave sites haunt the entire history of civilization. These are short-term fixes. The company that day that departed Egypt included all manner of people who had been shackled by their own economic necessity and by the aggressive economic requirements of the empire that kept them shackled. In this moment, Walter Brueggemann suggests that the nicety of identity could not prevail amid the haste of a rush to freedom. If you're running for the exit, you're not checking IDs, right? You're just getting out of there. And so this phrase translated as mixed multitude conjures a kind of disordered array of folk who are just making this mass exodus. And we have this contrast of the Pharaoh and his army who are ordered in phalanx, and they're marching in, and you have this mob of people just trying to rush the borders. And while that mixed company may have had a variety of known and valid identifications that they could have told us, they weren't the kind of identifications that are known or valued from above. So while that community itself has retained the names of Shiphrah and Puah, the first midwives to the Hebrew people, those names were likely not known by the company of the Pharaoh. We know that some genealogies and pedigrees are easier to access than others. Some of you may have watched Henry Louis Gates, his program on roots, or maybe you did your own cheek swab with 23andMe to try to get a sense of where did I come from, who are my people, and we see that some of those genealogies are more readily accessible than others. And so you've got this mass of people running for the door, and it may be for that reason in this newly ordered community on the other side of Egypt becomes a pretty great equalizer. Because if you're running for your lives, we're all kind of leveled the playing field in a certain way. And it says in Exodus 12, there shall be one law for the native and for the foreigner who reside among you. And this remarkable and radical provision runs directly and pretty counter to probably what the world order was in Egypt. In Egypt, you better believe there was hierarchy. There was pedigree. They knew who you belonged to and who was in and who was out, and they were the ones who decided. But such social differentiations couldn't be afforded in the company of the escapees, and they would not be countenanced for the future going forward. And what follows in the next Exodus narrative, it is that all of them, all these ex-slaves, all these departing folks, all going into the wilderness, entered a new future with different social distinctions. Because the issues for all of them were economic. They were running for their lives, escaping slavery. But because God intervenes, this becomes theological. As Walter Brueggemann says, this economics joined with theology creates a theo-economic disruption that would no longer have patience with social differentiation, because this was this time of equalizing. And so, as long as Israel was this refugee people on the outside looking in, such a commonality could prevail. But friends, remember there are these two strands that we talked about that are always at play in this text. And this pendulum tends to go back and forth between this adherence to this original vision that God gave us of liberation belonging to everyone, for freedom and welcome necessarily being something that we extend to every person. But as soon as the nation was settled and got into some place of relative security and affluence, these social differentiations began to appear again. And this juxtaposition of Israelite and mixed multitude disappeared, and they began to take on all the trappings of an identifiable people with trappings and a heritage and a land claim and a pedigree. And these former slaves became owners and possessors and administrators, and such social functions mandate credentials. And in Israel at that time, these credentials took the form of holiness rules and purity guidelines, so that religious merit went along with economic clout. And if you can say, that wouldn't happen here, I would just remind you we're sitting in pew boxes that for a long time were the funding structure in this community. And friends, these pews didn't all cost the same. Some of them were more top dollar than others. It's like if you were in the theater, if you were obscured by a column, it's going to be a discount, right? And there were folks in this city who had a pew box in every tall steeple church in Providence, because it was a way of showing their religious merit was tied to their economic clout. This isn't ancient history, friends. These are still ways that we identify and mark ourselves. And over time, there was a push with within the Israelite community to understand this specialness as being a holy people, distinct from others, belonging to God. And this wasn't at that point yet cast as an ethnic identity, but only as those who obeyed God's voice and kept the covenant. That meant that you were in the circle, if you obeyed the will of God and kept God's covenant. Over time, this status based on obeying God and adhering to the covenant evolved into a different kind of relationship, and it was one that had more obvious markers and came to be expressed in ethnic categories. And we see these holiness codes play out in other parts in the Old Testament. I will say parenthetically that when I was a child and I heard all these stories, I just assumed that I was Jewish, because clearly that's who we wanted to be. They were chosen. We were here. Who wants to be a Gentile? That sounds terrible. And I remember saying something to that effect to my Sunday school teacher. She said, no, we're Christians, and for the most part, we're Gentiles. I was devastated. I thought, someone should talk to me like this. This is not what I understood myself to be. I really had to do some work to understand that the circle of God's love is always getting drawn wider and wider, and how we understand ourselves as God's people, and who is in that circle of belonging. So how does a nation go from this mixed multitude walking together towards freedom to this narrowly defined holy remnant? Brueggemann suggests that the more the memory of slavery and emancipation remained palpable, the more that inclusion could be embraced. Conversely, the more remote the memory of slavery and emancipation became, the tighter the lines might be drawn on holiness. So the closer we are to remembering what it is to live with our backs against the wall, the more likely we are to embrace a broad welcome. And this tension between inclusiveness and exclusiveness remained unresolved in ancient Israel and emergent Judaism, and this spilled over into the Christian tradition. We see in the Gospels Jesus' own original vision that his message was just for one select group of people, until someone said, hey Jesus, let's kick the door open a lot wider. And that limit was expanded. In the next generation of the church, membership was expanded to include Gentiles, but there was this fight, this struggle to say, but how included are they? And there were fights over circumcision and dietary codes, to bacon or not to bacon. That is the Christian, right? And so they continued to have these struggles about who could be included and who couldn't, and who would decide. And if we think that we are still doing that today, friends, we need to check ourselves. And we need to go back to this original vision that the recipients of God's liberation are those who choose to follow the will of God, to live into God's covenant, and to live into these promises. The sweeping vision of inclusiveness in the gospel is dramatically performed in the first Pentecost, where this rush of the Spirit creates this community that speaks all languages out of people from all over the world. So who is this mixed multitude in our midst that's moving us all towards mutual freedom? We know that the Spirit rejects no one and doesn't have purity requirements that separate some and exclude others. The company in the book of Acts is a completely mixed multitude, all empowered by the Spirit and drawn to the emancipatory work of Jesus. So who is in our mixed multitude? Will we continue to draw our circle wider, inclusive of language and gender and orientation, ethnicity and ability? The furthest reach of hope in the New Testament is a gathering of this mixed multitude that sings praises to God in all eternity. Because friends, from everything I hear, heaven is a mixed neighborhood. So we are called to build that here on earth. So that's what we need to start doing here, in this place. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri wrote 2 political books on power and control. The first, Empire, traces the way that the concentration of power and wealth leads to hegemonic control that can be difficult to challenge. In their second book, Multitude, they envision a mass movement of a multitude toward democracy in a way that challenges and eventually overrides the hegemony of empire. They articulate this juxtaposition of and a contrast between these entrenched claims of empire and this emerging power of the multitude. And this dynamic is at work in Exodus and in the gospel narratives and still today. Because there is a force that wants always to impose rules of membership and regulations on qualifications and maintain a sort of control. But the Jesus movement, like the Moses movement, unleashes an energy for an alternative social possibility that is, by definition, a threat to the established social order. Why do you think they kicked Jesus out? Why do you think they finally said to Moses, just go? Brueggemann says that the purity of the church functions invariably by exclusion to eliminate all of those who don't meet some established norm. But by contrast, an accent on unity tends to welcome without imposing distinctions or qualifications and envisions this kind of multitude that God is calling us to. Because one cannot imagine people engaged in a freedom movement having a debate over who is eligible, for emancipation permits all to be eligible. The only requirement is to go and leave none behind. As my predecessor Dan Ivins liked to say here, we reserve the right to welcome everybody. The defining mark of this multitude is not race or language or pedigree or genealogy or orientation or even right belief. It is to be among the ones who have been left behind by the forces of empire. And these folks without claims or names that are recognized rallied to Moses, departed Egypt, and became the people of the covenant. Those who were not a people became God's people. Not German Israeli God's people or Congolese American God's people or Indian Canadian God's people, just God's people, full stop. Here you become citizens in the realm of God. 1 Peter says, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So how do we participate in bringing about this kind of mixed multitude empowered by the Spirit into community today? Ever since I was young, I love the hymn, When We All Get to Heaven. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing it will be. I didn't realize I had a universalist theology as a child, but it's heaven when we all get there. And it's heaven when we want all of us to get there. And until that happens, friend, we don't get. That's what we're supposed to practice here on earth. Because Israelis aren't going anywhere. Palestinians aren't going anywhere. Russia isn't going anywhere. Ukraine isn't going anywhere. Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs. There must be a way forward where we are able to live together. With God's help, we must make a way to be this mixed multitude. We don't have to take sides. This is not some sports team, because innocents are being harmed right now in Israel, in Gaza, and Illinois. And the price that we are paying currently by doing nothing is the loss of humanity of us all. Because we are talking about justice and peace and freedom for everyone in this mixed multitude. Wherever you come from, however old or young you are, whoever you love, we don't have to take sides. Because peace and justice aren't in limited supply. We don't have to mete them out stingily as though we're going to run out. As James Baldwin observed, the children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality. Now, many of us are feeling tremendous anger and sorrow and grief over the events of the past weeks. Know that these feelings stem from your love. They are signs that you have a living heart. And this new world that we are marching towards together needs more than coexistence. It needs ways of living together peacefully and cooperatively. A mixed multitude walking together towards freedom. An amalgamated blessing. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing it will be. I mean, there are hints of this happening Right now, the Pope has an ongoing synod happening, a historic ongoing gathering to discuss the future of the Roman Catholic Church, and for the first time it includes women and lay people and members that it can vote. There are possibilities. We see things beginning to shift. It's no longer just who is in and who's out. We are called to make a new thing. I close with a call from Sarah Centillis in her book, Draw Your Weapons. She writes, "Let there be light. Let there be no war. Let there be no battles on the whole globe. Let there be no planes in the sky raining down bullets. Let there be no trenches. Let there be no piles of dead bodies. Let there be no hollow-tipped bullets. Let there be no one in the desert in boxes kept at 65 degrees. Let there be no buttons to press. Let there be no buzzing. Let there be no shrapnel. Let there be no wailing. Let there be no bones breaking. Let there be no hoods. Let there be no blindfolds. Let there be no billy clubs. Let there be music. Let there be instruments waiting to be played. Let there be children. Let there be water. Let there be honeybees. Let there be farmers in the fields. Let them all be left standing. Let the fields be fertile. Let the harvest be enough. Let the seeds be saved. Let there be cameras. Let there be photographs. Let there be people watching monitors looking for anyone in pain. Let there be songbirds. Let there be blue skies and no one to fear them. Let there be dreaming in the night. Let there be people sleeping on rooftops and under blankets and nothing to frighten them awake. Let there be feasting. Let there be singing. Let there be people rushing out of houses to dance together in the streets. Let there be pictures brought to lips and kissed. Let there be ghosts just behind. Let there be remorse. Let there be shame. Let there be truth-telling. Let there be accountability. Let there be repair. Let there be forgiveness. Let there be weapons laid down and never lifted. Let there be clean water to drink. Let there be cherry blossoms and mice smelling them and no shock. Let there be no one standing on boxes. Let there be no island blown apart. Let there be no waking in the dead of night to take down all the photographs. Let there be grief. Let there be grief for all bodies. Let them be counted. Let there be names for every one. Let there be antidotes. Let there be salves. Let there be poets. Let there be painters. Let there be sculptors. Let there be woodworkers. Let there be enough money for school. Let there be gardens. Let there be wilderness. Let there be empty cells. Let the trauma in cells be reversed. Let laughter be what's passed down. Let there be language. Let there be letters. Let there be words. Let there be stories. Let there be memos that explain how to love. Let there be doubt. Let there be people gathered. Let there be keening. Let there be never again. Let there be rest. Let there be solace. Let there be only birds' wings passing over the sun. Let there be breath. Let there be lift. Let there be places to be alone. Let there be hiding places. Let there be ancient trees. Let there be living creatures of every kind. Let there be good. Let there be only good. Let there be no reason to look away. Let there be mixed multitudes walking together towards freedom.